I just picked up this 2000 KX250 from a seller that got scammed on Facebook Marketplace. The original seller said it only needed a top end. The guy I bought it from took it home, looked at it, realized it seized up immediately. What I'm gonna be doing today is what do I look for when I'm buying a used bike? Because nowadays it's very easy to get scammed or taken advantage of when you're trying to buy a used bike. And the prices of used bike are still up a little bit. They have come down now. These are the basic things I look for when I'm buying a used dirt bike. So one thing I do recommend, if the bike looks anything like this and you're just trying to go out and ride it, I would just walk away right away, because obviously this bike is all torn down. I knew this while buying this, but if the bike's all torn down and you're just looking for something to rip and ride for the rest of the season or the beginning of the season, stay away from a bike that's torn down like this. A small problem, it's usually the problems that are easy to fix, don't have time, that end up being a problem like this, where the crank's locked up, the piston's screwed up, and the cylinder bore's all tore up. So one of the first things I like to do when I meet up with the seller and I see the bike for the first time is a really easy and simple thing. I like to take and look under the rear fender and the front fender as well. And I like to see how much mud and dirt are built up under there. And I like to look under the engine cases as well. And this sounds crazy. If there's a bunch of dirt and mud under the fenders and under the engine cases and all over the bike, you could tell that the seller did not maintain the bike very well. What happens when dirt sits on bikes for a long time, especially underneath? It will get into the swing arm bearings, the shock bearings, and the linkage bearings, and it'll end up corroding those out. And if the bike is really dirty and the seller didn't care enough to wash it before he came there, he probably didn't care much about the bike as it is. Next thing I like to do as I'm looking around the bike is I like to check out the condition of the tires. So this bike right here is needing a new front tire. You can see the knobbies are starting to tear off completely. You can actually see some belts in that one, and the tire is just overall worn down. I also, as I'm looking at the tires, I'll look at both tires. You can see this rear one is just pretty much a drag slick. I also like to look for missing, bent, or loose spokes. And one way, I just rotate the wheel, look all around it, and see if there's any spokes missing. And what you can do to check for loose spokes is just take a wrench like this, tap it, that one's loose. You can actually hear a difference. So this spoke is about the right tension. You can kind of hear it has a nice ping to it. That one's a little tighter. That one's way too tight. This one's a little loose. You can hear a tone difference in when you're spinning the spoke. Now, if you've been around bikes for a while, you know this trick, but it's a really good way to also tell if the bike's been maintained well. There's actually a zip tie on these spokes, so I'm thinking, why is there a zip tie on these spokes? Well, that is because the spoke is extremely loose. That's another quick and easy way to look at the bike's maintenance history, because good maintenance would be checking your spokes regularly at a regular interval. So loose spokes, dirty fenders, dirty undercarriage is all signs of lack of maintenance. Next thing I like to do is check for leaking front forks. You can see in this case we have pretty bad leaking front forks. Not the worst I've seen. You can actually see it when they're really, really bad, that the fork oil is built up on the fork lug on the bottom here. And one main thing you want to watch out, leaking forks are pretty common. Sometimes you could just take a dust seal cleaning tool and get the dirt out of there and the leak will go away. But if it's so bad that it's built up down here, or it's so bad that it's contaminating the brake pads and rotors, that is something you got to watch out for, because if you don't know how to rebuild your front suspension, it can be pretty pricey. And leaking front forks that are contaminating the brakes will make your front brake basically useless, and your front suspension with no oil in it and worn out components will not be very good. You'll have a lot of front end chop, the front end will feel all over the place, and the bike really won't be controlling how you want it to control. So definitely watch out for leaking front forks. And if it's so bad that all the oil is down here, that is one thing to note. And a lot of these maintenance items, guys, if you can do the work yourself, the parts aren't all that expensive. It's just what is worth it to you. If you can't do the work and you have to have a shop do the work, well, I would try to look for a bike that's in pretty good shape. But if you're capable of doing the work, the parts usually aren't too bad. Like a front fork rebuild kit's about $100, roughly, right around there. And then you add the oil. So you're looking at about $120 to rebuild your front forks if you could do it yourself. But if you can't, then you could be looking at anywhere from $400 to $500 to $600 for a front fork rebuild on a bike you just paid, let's say $1,500 for, and then you're waiting for it at the shop. So it's something you guys got to keep in mind, that if you're willing to do the work yourself, parts are usually available and they're pretty cheap. So if you can get the parts, no big deal. You might be able to work with the bike there. But if the parts list is just adding up and you're going to be taking the bike to a shop, then I'd recommend walking away and looking for something a little bit better shape. And the same thing goes for the rear suspension. If you see a lot of oil buildup on that center shaft there, that chrome piece, then you'll be having a leaking rear shock as well. And rear shocks are certainly more difficult and more expensive to rebuild than front forks. So leaking rear shock is another thing you want to look for. Another thing you could test if the bike is on a stand is the wheel bearings. So what you want to do is grab the wheel and try to stake it left and right. So this way, the way I'm pointing this way, and up and down a little bit. And the goal is you don't want to feel any play. If you feel a lot of play side to side, that means that the wheel bearings are bad and you'll have to be replacing those. You definitely don't want loose wheel bearings in your wheels. And if you're racing it on a track or trail, whatever you're doing, that is something you want to get fixed as soon as possible. Same thing goes for the front wheel. Just take the wheel, lift it off the ground slightly, and try to wiggle it side to side. No play is good. If you've got play and a lot of slop, that is not good. You'll be needing to do your front wheel bearings. Another thing I like to do while the bike is on the stand is to put some weight on the back end of the bike so it's pushing down towards the ground a little bit. Grab the rim like this and pull up. Now, a lot of times, the swing arm bearings, the shock bearings, and the linkage bearings will be going out on bikes. That's another sign of poor maintenance. Because those bearings should be greased on regular intervals, and if they're not, they could be an absolute pain to get out because rust builds up really bad, and you don't want bad swing arm or shock bearings because that will make your back end feel squirrely. So one thing I like to do is to put some weight on the back of the bike, grab the rear tire, and pull up. Now you can see this bike has some play. So where's the play coming from? A lot of times it is the shock bearings. So I will show you guys where that play is coming from now. You guys can see as I move the swing arm up and down, there is play in that top shock bearing. So that is definitely something you're gonna wanna address before the problem gets worse or fails completely. When you guys are doing that swing arm trick as well, you'll be wanting to look for play up here in the top shock bearing, down here where my finger is in the bottom shock bearing. And you'll also be wanting to look for play in your linkage bearing. So here, 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 and the swing arm as well. What the swing arm can do a lot is it'll have some up and down play, and it'll also have side to side play right here and on the opposite side of the bike as well. So what you could do next, rolling into the engine stuff, if the seller allows, you could pull off the seat of the bike and look into the air filter. Now, generally it's a 10 to 12 millimeter bolt to get that out. So what you want to do when you get the seat off is take a look at the air filter. If the air filter is extremely dirty or very dry, like this one, for example, you could tell has not been oiled in a very long time, but it's not that dirty. So if you pull this seat and the air filter looks disgusting, dirty, full of dirt, mud, and sand, that's one sign that the bike has not been maintained very well, because what you should do is pretty much change these air filters after every ride. Especially if you're riding in a very dusty climate. These filters attract a lot of dirt and dust. And if they get too clogged up, eventually that dirt and dust has to go somewhere, ends up in your engine, scoring up your piston and cylinder. So if you guys are looking at the bike and you're looking to ride and run it that same season or very soon on a low budget, if your engine looks anything like this, I would absolutely run the opposite way, because this engine is at catastrophic failure. It needs a complete top end, including cylinder and piston, crankshaft. It needs a top and bottom end rebuild. So this is going to be about $1,000 roughly, and that's doing all the work myself. So if you're on a budget and you're looking to ride the bike soon, I would stay away from something that looks like this. But on these older Kawasaki's, one thing that's nice is there is an oil level indicator right where my finger is, and I'll show you that now. So before you hear the bike run as you're trying to buy it, one thing you could do is check the engine oil. So here, there's actually a sight glass in here, and what you should see is the engine oil in this little sight glass. Now, if you don't, that's a problem. What you can do is pull the bike sideways, and you should start to see some engine oil coming up on that cover. We've got a little bit here. So you should see some kind of oil in this sight glass, and if you don't, I will show you one other thing you can do. Now, it depends if your bike has a dipstick or not. A lot of two-strokes like this bike here do not. So what you can do is pop the oil fill cap off. Take a look at the bottom side. I always like to see some oil on there. And now what I like to do is take a zip tie and dip it into that crankcase here. Pull it out, look for any oil. In this case, we're not seeing any, which is a good sign to run away. We've seen that on the sight glass. Okay, so this one, you can see there's just a little bit of residue coming up on that oil on the zip tie. That is not a good sign. That means we have no oil in this transmission. So we've got no oil in this transmission. Definitely not a good thing. What that's going to be doing is wearing out your transmission bearings, your transmission gears, your clutch. Every bearing in there, every gear, every moving part needs oil to stay lubricated and free from wear. So if there's no oil in here and the bike has been running, that is not a good sign. That transmission is probably in desperate need of some attention. Now, if it is a two-stroke bike like this, no oil in the crankcase doesn't necessarily mean that the engine is going to be shot, top end, and crank, because on a two-stroke, the cylinder, crank bearings, and all the top end components are lubricated by the gasoline. That's why you add oil to the gasoline. So you could have no oil in your crankcase, but your top end's fine. But if there is no oil in your crankcase, I would still go the other way, because transmission work is just as expensive as cylinder work. So I'm moving over to my YZ right now because I can't show you on that bike because it doesn't have radiators. One other thing you want to check is come over here and pop your radiator cap off. So with that cap off, you're going to want to see coolant in there. Now, I know you guys can't see it, but you want the coolant to be nice, either bright green color or blue, depending on the coolant they use. And you can't see inside mine, so what I did is just dip my finger in there, and you can see that I've got some coolant on my finger now. So roughly about a 1/4 inch below this bottom fill line here will be perfect. And don't feel bad if you're in front of the seller and you can't get the radiator cap back on, because I struggle with that all the time. So another thing I want to show you guys on my YZ here, because I can't do it on that one, is what I like to do if the engine is all assembled and put together. I like to take the Kickstarter and push it down. Now, what you want to feel on this is a good amount of resistance. If this just goes freely, that means that the bike has no compression. Now, it does depend on if the bike's a 2 or 4 stroke and what CC it is, how much resistance this Kickstarter will have. So I can't tell you exactly how hard it should be, but let's say if it's a 252 stroke, it should take a decent amount of effort to push this thing down. If it's a 125 two-stroke, these can push down relatively easy. The compression on these is, I've seen a lot of 125s, you can actually start with your hand. So you want a good amount of resistance on this, and when you're cranking it over slow, you don't want to hear anything too crazy going on inside. So it should sound smooth. You don't want to hear anything grinding or sounding nasty when you're pushing that Kickstarter down. Now, if the ad says the bike runs, but the seller is not allowing you to start the bike, there's a very good chance that that bike has a serious problem inside the engine. Either it has a really bad knock, a really bad tick, or it's smoking like crazy out of the exhaust. If it's a 4-stroke and it's smoking like crazy and the smoke has a little bit of a blue tint to it, that means the bike's burning oil really bad. If it's a 2-stroke and it's smoking, well, it's pretty normal. What you want to be listening for is any sounds that don't sound normal. So 4-strokes can sound a little bit weird sometimes. What you're listening for is a knock-in sound, ticking sound, a pinging sound. Anything that sounds like it's rattling real bad inside the engine would be a good sign that that engine needs a lot of work. Now, I also want to go into, if you guys are looking into a 2 or 4-stroke, one thing you got to keep in mind when buying a 4-stroke used bike is if that engine is blown up, your rebuild costs are going to be a lot more expensive versus a 2-stroke. 4-strokes are a lot more complex inside. There's a lot more moving parts. Those parts are more expensive. So what you could be looking at for a top-end rebuild on a 2-stroke would be, let's say, about $200 versus a 4-stroke. It can go from anywhere from $500 to $1,000, depending on the cylinder work, the head work, the valve work, stuff like that. So one thing you got to keep in mind versus buying 2 or 4-stroke is the price differences of those in between. So if you start the bike, it sounds good, it's not smoking, that's a very good sign that the engine is probably in good shape. Obviously, I can't start this one up for you guys because she's locked up solid. Sometimes the sellers won't let you ride the bike without cash in hand, which is normal. They don't want you taking off with it. So that's fine. What I like to do when I'm test driving it is make sure the bike goes through all the gears. So whether it's a 5 or 6-speed transmission, I like to make sure that I have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, nice and smooth. And I also make sure you can go up and down with no binding. While I'm on that test drive as well, I like to check that the brakes are functioning, so rear and front. You could tell, obviously, if it's stopping the bike, but you want a nice, firm, smooth grab throughout the whole stroke of the brake and with the rear as well. So if you do a test ride on the bike and everything seems to be going good, I would not immediately say you're going to buy it. One thing you want to do, once the bike gets up to operating temperature, it gets warm, make sure it can restart while hot. That's a good sign on a 4-stroke. If it's not starting while hot, well, you might need some valve work. Another thing is, some bikes will not leak oil until they're warmed up. what happens is the oil thins out and the cases expand. So if you have an oil leak, sometimes it won't leak when it's cold, but when you get it warmed up, it'll start leaking. So one thing I like to do once the bike's hot is just let it sit for a little bit. Not super long, I don't want to waste anyone's time, but just make sure that I don't have any oil drips coming down. Another thing you could do is take the bike off the stand, or if it's leaning up against the wall or anything like that. What I like to do is I like to hold the bike with one hand, look underneath, and see if there's any cracks anywhere in the frame, if it's a steel frame or aluminum. If it's steel, I'm looking for a rusted out frame or any cracks. They could be hairline, very small, very hard to see sometimes. Same with aluminum. Aluminum, you won't see a rusted out frame, but you'll still can see cracks. So one thing, I'm just checking over all the frame, looking for any cracks, anything like that. Framework can get very expensive if you don't know how to weld, especially aluminum frames, because aluminum welding is more specialty. So definitely make sure that your frame is not cracked. If it is, me personally, I would go the other way. If it's a steel frame, I would probably keep it because I could weld it here, but aluminum frame, I would run the other direction. One other thing I like to do as I'm looking under the bike is look for anything under these cases that is cracked, JB welded, RTV siliconed, anything like that. What I've seen quite a bit is leaking drain plugs that have a load of RTV around them. I've also seen plenty of things down here that are JB welded. What can happen a lot is a rock comes up and goes right through this case, and it gets a puncture in it, and then they JB weld it. Now, if it's this outer clutch cover case or this clutch cover that's cracked, that personally, for me, won't turn me the other direction because those two cases are pretty cheap and they're not that big of a deal. When you get down into the crankcases, those can get very expensive, sometimes $600 a case. So if those are cracked, that's always very concerning to me because that can get very, very expensive. I've seen hundreds of these outer clutch covers that are cracked from rocks or whatever come up and chip these. These are cheap. You can get these for about 80 to 100 bucks. So no big deal. It does matter if the crack's super low and all the oil ran out when they're riding the bike. That's something you could be concerned of. But if the engine seems to run good, there's oil in it. If this outer clutch cover is cracked, I've seen that a lot. It's not that big of a deal. Same with this next cover here. Not that big of a deal. You can get these pretty cheap as well. It's just those main crankcases you want to look out for. Now, if this seller allows, I do recommend putting the bike down on a stand like this because that gives you a very good view of the underside. It gives you a good view of your linkage. You could see if that has fresh grease in it or anything like that. Sometimes you can see a little bit of grease coming out the sides. Not on this one. That's just an indication if that linkage has ever been greased. That is one of the most forgotten things on bikes. It rarely gets done, and it's one of the most important. People don't realize how important maintaining your linkage bearings are. But I also like to look at the underside and see if there's a bunch of dirt built up. One thing you got to keep in mind, if there is a bunch of dirt built up underneath your engine, that will also hide oil leaks. The oil will get trapped in the dirt. So one thing you want to check for is dirt buildup underneath the bike. Most people I know that take really good care of their machines, including myself, whenever we power wash, we put the bike on the stand like this and blast underneath. So if the bike runs good, feels good, shifts good, everything in between, I would go ahead and grab the bike. There's a couple things like, triple tree bearings I see go out all the time. You'll get a little bit tighter steering, no big deal. Those are easy to replace, cheap to replace. Stuff like the swing arm bearings, the linkage bearings I see go all the time as well. It depends on how much you want to do, if you're going to be doing the work yourself, and how much money you want to be putting into the bike as soon as you get it. It all depends. I buy bikes like this all the time that are tore down, completely blown up, because I personally love to work on them. But if your budget allows and you're willing to do it, I do recommend picking up a bike that needs some work because you could find some good deals that way. And sometimes it's a small problem and the bike runs great, or sometimes it's a bigger problem. You just got to know what you're looking for. But if your budget allows, I do highly recommend picking up a bike that needs some work and fixing it up yourself. It's super fun and not that hard. In my personal experience, what it usually comes down to, if you're getting a bike that's going to be an absolute nightmare or great, is just the maintenance of it. So that really comes down to how the bike was washed, maintained, oil changed, filters, stuff like that. If I'm seeing that the bike has a bunch of mud and it's stained really bad on our plastics, usually it sounds weird, but that's the #1 sign that that bike was not maintained. You can't really take the time to change your air filter, your oil, all that stuff. So if you don't wash it, usually that's my #1 red flag when buying a bike, because that is the bare minimum generally, is just getting the bike washed. So it sounds weird, but that's one of the main things I look for, is just how clean the bike is. If it's super clean, usually a good sign. If it's not, bike probably wasn't maintained that well. But hope this video helped you guys on trying to buy a used bike and not getting scammed. Thank you guys for watching, and stay tuned. If you're interested in this 2000 KX250, we are doing a full frame up build on it. There will be a video coming up soon of the teardown and the overview of this bike. But hope you guys enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for the 2000 KX250 build.